All right, all right. Good morning to everyone, all our partners on the West Coast. It's high noon here in Raleigh on the East Coast, and welcome to February's sales webinar. I'm Bob Buchanan, EVP of Sales and Marketing at RapidScale, and a little twist on today. Got Andrew Lauder joining us for this session. Andrew, you out there, buddy?
Yeah. Good afternoon and good morning.
I can't believe we put your picture on here. You're like the team mascot. So if you haven't, do me a favor for everyone that maybe most people are. I don't mean to offend you. Most people are certainly aware of Andrew. You got a great reputation because you've got some tenure with us. But give everybody a little bit of your background.
Yeah. So thanks, Bob. So Andrew Lauder, been here for going on 5 years. Was one of the first employees over on the East Coast with RapidScale. So I've certainly seen the evolution of the channel, the evolution of the marketplace around the cloud space and the overall adoption. So obviously very fun time to be here. I've seen a lot, know a little bit, and I'm certainly happy to help out wherever I can.
Appreciate that. So I dragged you into today because we're talking about managing cloud objections, and nobody, I think, on the team is probably more experienced at helping our partners get through some of this than you are. So without further ado, let's kind of get into it here. So just one moment. All right, there we go. So as always, folks, the session's being recorded, and we will send out the recording along with a copy of the deck following the session within 24 hours. If you've got questions, you certainly can hit us through chat or email. You can come to me directly after, come to Andrew, and certainly you can hit us at marketing@RapidScale. If there's any questions during the session, we'll hold those for the end, and we'll take as many as we can. So maturation of the cloud market. If you look at these numbers, Andrew, I don't think either of us are too surprised, right? We're inundated with different data points from the analysts on a daily basis. But I think one of the things you and I talked about just recently was, if you look at these trends, what's it really kind of suggesting, especially with this hyper growth? And I think, we were talking recently, and what struck me was, hey, is our pipeline growth growing? And more importantly, is our partners' pipeline growth growing kind of in parallel? What are your thoughts on just what you're seeing out there in the market and what's happening from overall cloud growth, and not only in 17 as we came out of the year, but looking ahead into 18?
Yeah, so it's obviously a great time to be in the space. So it's funny because, we spent pretty much all day, years ago, trying to build together, put trainings together, educate the partners how to recognize cloud opportunities, what to look for, right? How to bring a level of comfort around them moving to the cloud so we could set up conversations. And that was great, and it was certainly necessary and needed to be done. But now at this point, we're seeing a lot more reaction from the partners because the customers are now coming to them, right? So obviously very important for you guys to make it aware to your customer base that you do have these services available through you, and to come to you for this stuff. But they're starting to ask the questions themselves because just like everybody else, they're becoming educated because they care about their business and they recognize that this is the right way for them to take their business.
Well, I think the key point there, man, is we kind of are leaving this era of trying to convince the partner, or I'm sorry, trying to convince the customer that hey, you should be doing this, you should be adopting cloud, right? So we're no longer in this convincing stage. We're much more into an acceptance stage, and I think that's a theme for the rest of the discussion, right? Whereas years ago we might have been saying, hey, these are the benefits, this is why you should do this. Customers today they've come to that conclusion themselves, and to your point, they're asking us, how do we engage? Mm-hmm. So past common objections, and when I say past, I don't mean 20 years ago. I mean, as we started to hear, what is this thing? What is the cloud, right? And that goes back 5 years. Maybe, we started to hear about this in the mid 2000s, in the definition in general just started to mature. How do you describe the cloud, Andrew?
So I think that there's a couple different ways to describe the cloud, right? I mean, and there's different forms of the cloud: private, public, dedicated, hyperscalers. So I think that in talking about the cloud and describing the cloud, you kind of understand what the customer is. So one of the things with the maturity of this space is we're now better to classify where a specific customer is going to fit within the cloud space. So, obviously at the end of the day, the cloud is a bunch of servers working in a data center, hosting core line of business applications and data, right? But what kind of cloud is the best fit for the customer is kind of what we want to talk about, right? Obviously, a large enterprise company might be more fit for the hyperscalers, where SMB mid-market will be a better fit for RapidScale. So I mean, kind of, long story short, the cloud is a lot of things to a lot of different people, right? Depending on who you're talking to, but kind of recognizing who they are and what they need is kind of key to drive that conversation.
Right. So I think we came from an era where, hey, is the cloud the network? Is the cloud, software? Is the cloud compute infrastructure? And really, I think we're coming to standards, and the conclusion it's really all of the above. It's a way of consuming IT and technology in a different manner than doing it yourself versus a traditional IT model, right? So it's typically your data and your applications are now external. I think everyone is pretty comfortable with that. And then where is my data? I think that's the big challenge. Is my data, I'm afraid, is my data out there just on servers all over the country, or is it located in a central location? And that's part of our value proposition, right? That we can tell our customers and our partners exactly where the data is. Other common objections in the past were, hey, what about latency? If my end users are in one part of the country or one part of the globe, do I have to be closer? Does the infrastructure need to be closer to them? And those are still concerns today. Not that they aren't, but with technology, number one, improving things like content delivery networks, as well as just the maturation of internet and available IP and WAN infrastructure and SD-WAN and application acceleration. Latency is less and less of a concern today. I think you might agree with that.
Yeah, and just kind of a good benchmark for everybody to know in case you don't know, kind of best practices, at least for RapidScale, and I'm pretty sure it's industry standard, is 80 milliseconds or less for a production environment. So for us, obviously, we've geographically dispersed our data centers so that we don't have that anywhere in the country. And now, of course, with the international pops as well, we can cover that side. So just be cognizant of that. And also, it's very simple to run a ping test to our data center to see what that latency is going to be on a day-to-day basis for them.
Good point. Another one is, hey, we have data backup. Why would we need disaster recovery? And I think it's common, right? So I've got maybe data that I'm backing up, and maybe I'm backing it up locally. Maybe it could be on the same, God forbid it's on the same server, but maybe it's on a separate target in the same data center. And maybe I have some level of protection, but why would I need DR? Do you come across this often?
I do, and it's a business decision essentially, right? Because backups they should be a standard, right? You delete a file, you need to restore it. You get a virus, you need to restore from an image, right? From a previous snapshot. So backups need to happen. They need to be off-site. I think we all can agree upon that. DR is going to be more for highly sensitive downtime type customers where they can't afford to be down for more than 24 hours, right? So really, it's just taking a look at that, and we actually have a formula we put together based off of annual revenue and downtime and how much it will cost for a business to be down for an extended period of time, which we're happy to work together with you and show them. But it becomes is that number going to be bigger than what it costs them from a monthly spend to have the ability to fail over and have a highly available solution?
I kind of think of data backup as data survivability, and then disaster recovery is data really server recovery, application recovery.
Yep.
And there's definitely a distinct difference. So I definitely have come across this one. We need a provider who owns their own data center, and I'll take a stab at this. I've worked in a number of different cloud and colocation providers, and I think we left an era where it was very common for especially colocation providers who changed their business and started to have a very call it heterogeneous portfolio and wanted to start offering cloud options. And they were targeting customers that were primarily regional. And those customers like to feel, touch, visit the data center, come inside, sit down, and be able to see a lot of the blinking lights. And while I understand that's an emotional requirement, it really isn't a requirement in today's world of cloud. And if you think hyperscale, Amazon, Google, if you think, some of the other big guys, even a Rackspace, for example, and then think RapidScale, you know what? None of those guys always are owning their own data centers, and it's just less common. Instead, they're focused on their core competencies versus actual running facilities. The facilities game is a whole nother ball game. Not only that, it's a big barrier to entry, especially with the cost models to build out those environments. So that's why you see the data center business is growing at such a fast rate, because all the cloud companies want to focus on what they do well and let the data center companies and real estate players kind of focus on that business. We can't lose control of our data. How often do you see this one, Andrew?
So this is a very consistent objection that we get from a lot of customers, right? And there's kind of two ways to describe it. One, it's their intellectual property rights. It's not our data, so as long as they're in good financial standing, right? But really the way that I would approach this if I was on the partner side or even on my side, what I tell the customers is get a secondary backup that you have full access to, right? In our case, our backup, the customer has full access to those. They can go pull those snapshots out if they want to. Or if you feel even on the other side, go tertiary, which is a third form of backup to a location that's outside of RapidScale's cloud. We certainly accept that, and they can do that if they so choose.
I agree. And then, hey, we can do it cheaper internally. I think cost is always a factor, isn't it?
Yeah, and this is one thing I've been saying for probably 4 years, right? Because traditional agent model, there's a lot of cost savings around your traditional voice and data services, right? Probably the worst thing you could ever do is to walk into a customer and say, hey, I can save you money by going to the cloud, right? Because it's just very hard to compare apples to apples to premises versus this cloud. However, we can get into that conversation around, the ongoing costs of software upgrades and hardware upgrades, right, and do that. But really what we want to talk about is the value behind doing this as opposed to, the economics of doing it yourself, because really if it's a true opportunity to move to the cloud and there's initiative, we're not going to have the conversation around doing it on premise, right? We might look at it, but it shouldn't be a factor.
So these are past objections, and I think some of these objections we still see today, but I think the common point here is that the marketplace is getting more comfortable with these objections, and they're coming to the conclusion that they're not as prevalent or maybe as large a concerns as they were. What we're seeing today, and I'll focus on a few core that come up consistently, right? Security, right? We have seen big press headlines around some of the biggest companies in the world, Equifax, Visa, Target, right? All these things are happening out there, and it gets everyone uncomfortable what's happening within, on the internet. And in general, that bleeds into, well, is the cloud safe? And major objection still today is my data needs to be secure. There's no way of knowing if it's secure on the cloud. And that's somewhat of a fallacy. And I'll skip some of the bullets, the rebuttal here, and we'll go back to those in a moment. And I'll go right down to the bottom. I don't know if everyone's familiar with David Lithicum, but he is well followed in the cloud space. He's definitely one of the most recognizable thought leaders in this space. And he says using the cloud is like putting your money in the bank versus under your mattress. Even though your money or data is not on premise, the bank will do a much better job protecting it because it has vaults and security cameras more than what a single enterprise company can do. And to draw a parallel to that, it's, hey, these organizations, especially mid-market and down, especially, they lack the resources, they lack the expertise. And the cloud companies, not just RapidScale, but we'll include ourselves in this picture, have hundreds, if not thousands, of customers. that are across all different types of verticals that are seeing these threats every day. So they've gotten good at mitigating the risk versus your mid-market customer who is limited IT staff, who's trying to and faced with all these different challenges, right? So I think that's the biggest takeaway. The last bullet point that says their largest threat to security is lack of qualified professionals in the industry. That's huge. That's much bigger than the actual threats that are out there. It's because you need IT professionals and talent to come up with the strategies and mitigate that risk. Well, the problem is that most of those guys have gone to the service providers. They're hard to find. And I really think that the market's starting to really realize that, you know what, it's not as risky to move to the cloud as I thought it was. Any final thoughts on this one, Andrew?
Yeah, so when I hear somebody talking about security, I almost look at it more as an opportunity as opposed to an objection, because really the security that we're bringing to a solution for a customer is going to be more robust for the most part than anything they can do themselves. So if they care about security, I think that warrants a conversation around what exactly do they care about in regards to security, and then how can we augment that on our side and put things in place, right?
And you're not even to mention, when you talk security, most people often just think about the network, which they should. You think about the application, how do I protect it? But there's a physical aspect to it as well, right? Having multi-factor authentication and being able to prevent others from just getting into that environment, and really the human risk.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, that opens up the topic of DDoS mitigation, security information, event monitoring, right? Getting into the stack and really talking about, you know, building in security practices for the applications as well.
Exactly right. Man, another one, and I think this is where, you know, where we really shine is around migrations. I mean, how do I get from A to Z? How do I move to the cloud? It's too much work. What do I actually have to do myself versus what the service provider is responsible for? This is every day something that we're faced with. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, and it's also a fun conversation because, you know, we essentially control our own destiny when it comes to this. So whenever they start talking about migration, I'm looking to win a deal, right, by bringing a level of comfort and credibility around our ability to bring them from where they're at to our cloud in the most seamless way possible, right, through statements of works and things of that nature, right, the technology we leverage to do this stuff. So this is a good conversation. This is one of which customers are very they're very sensitive. I have a quick analogy that I do this. Very similar to building a house, right? If you build a house, it takes a year to build a house. You move in. If you have people coming back every other day to fix stuff that keeps breaking as you're living there, you're obviously not going to be very satisfied with the job that the builder did. However, if they go in prior to you moving in and be proactive and go and fix everything, it's very minimal in the back end, you're going to be happy. Same thing in the cloud environment. You stand up environment, migrate them over, get them turned up and cut over, and then you have to fix things that are broken every day, they can be pissed off. Whether it's do it right, do it light, and then have a good plan going into it. So this is a good conversation, one of which you should have, knowing your customer, knowing their abilities internally, and then being able to tailor-made the migration strategy around that.
Easy, buddy. This is a family affair. I'm just kidding. I completely agree with you. What I would say here, though, and what's really important for our partners to understand is that most of the service providers are very interested. Their primary concern is recurring revenue. Thus, they're staffed to provide ongoing recurring support. They're not staffed to handle PS and migrations. What you commonly will see, which those PS and migrations are associated with what? It's usually a one-time cost to do this. What you commonly will see is they will outsource that work. They will outsource that work to a third-party vendor, and we will not. We do not trust the customer experience to a third-party vendor, that we want to do this ourselves. And to your point, which should be overemphasized, we would prefer to do it ourselves because we can control a clean install. And when we inherit the in-life support of those workloads in that environment, we know that we migrate it there, and we can mitigate kind of the surprises, if you will, versus another third party or the customer delivering it to us and then expecting us to manage it up through the technology stack.
Exactly right. Not to mention,
So
we get a good familiarity with the environment by doing that migration ourselves.
you got it, 100%. So the next one I see here, and by the way, cost is a factor that'll never go away. It's an emotional piece. It was one of the early objections, and it remains an objection today. It's not, however, though, a major driver to the cloud, right? It's just the major drivers are more things like speed to market. I want to be competitive. Maybe I want an OpEx model versus CapEx model, but it's definitely a common objection. And there's a consensus out there at sometimes that you might find IT stakeholders that can say cloud services are expensive. After a year or so, I can just buy my own hardware and manage it myself. I go back down to the last bullet there, which I love, and it's something after 15 years in this space. I couldn't agree with this anymore. It's enterprises can always find a way to do them cheaper themselves, but cheaper doesn't equal better. It's not possible to duplicate features of cloud architecture for less. So when that statement there, we're talking about redundancy. We're talking about scale. We're talking about the physical attributes that are put into the data center, the network, the compute architecture, supported 24/7, 365, and consuming compute and licensing on demand as the business dictates versus over deploying compute or having more capacity than you actually need. That's a traditional IT mindset. And yes, if you want to do that, you can always find a cheaper route. You're just not going to inherently benefit from the value of what these cloud options deliver. Now, it might make sense to do that, to be honest. If you have an application or you have an environment where security is not valued, uptime's not valued, there's really nothing happening within that application that's critical to running that business every day, well, you know what? Do it yourself and do it cheap. We're finding, though, that that's more and more not as common, right? It's exactly the opposite. I'm relying on technology to run this business. It's incredibly critical to the operation. There's the risk level and tolerance for risk. My tolerance for risk is very low, and I've got to make sure that the business and the data and the applications are protected. Well, doing it yourself becomes a lot more expensive.
Yeah, I agree. And I would just add one more thing to that. Emphasize the benefits of the cloud, right? OpEx model, getting out of CapEx, as well as the predictable cost around, growth of your organization in IT, which is something I stress a lot.
When we think about the work that we're in, Andrew, one of the cores to our business is desktop as a service, right? So if you're in that space and you know that you're going to have, for example, like a merger or acquisition coming up, and you're bringing on your company's in that stage of a life cycle where you're going to be bringing on a third more capacity, meaning headcount, or things are going to be somewhat in flux, and the future may be somewhat unpredictable and less static. Having an on-demand cloud-based model to handle those type of demands makes a heck of a lot of sense than managing infrastructure that you have to either risk over deploying or under deploying the amount of compute that you're actually going to need and licensing. It's just too difficult to capacity plan.
Exactly right.
So the next one here, I think this might be our last objection, but it's one we hear commonly, and I'd really like to get your thoughts. I know our partners would, on what role are the hyperscalers playing from a barrier to some of these deals.
So for us, not much, right? Because anybody that's going to be able to, anybody that's a good fit for RapidScale, for the most part, is going to leverage us for a lot of services that we're able to provide on the back end, right? Such as management, white glove migrations, things of that nature. The hyperscalers are very much a DIY model or do-it-yourself model. So if you've got the team and the staff, you want to go in there and do it yourself, you probably should, right? But if you need some hand-holding, you need some expertise, you need Citrix engineers, right? That's where we're going to come in and be able to assist, right? Even for customers that want to manage it themselves, just having that backboard of support 24/7, 365 is crucial for them.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Right? I think that partners need to start by trying to understand the customer's profile. Right? Ask yourself, does this customer have a very deep or limited IT bench? I would especially be looking at, is there an internal software application team? And that's important because software developers, DevOps teams, they like to build code, and a lot of them prefer to do that and have those test environments and those dev environments within the hyperscalers, whether that be AWS or Azure, and they're comfortable there. If they don't, so that's not, brick and mortar businesses typically don't. They're buying off the shelf software. They're using software as a service, or some type of third-party app, right? And where do those live, right? They probably live on a VM or a physical box, and if it can be supported by a VM, it's a perfect customer for us, especially if they want to manage uptime. They need support with networking. They need support with patching operating systems. A lot of the day-to-day kind of grunt work that IT teams don't want to do but are forced to do, and we allow them to stay focused on their more strategic initiatives. So another thing to look for would be static versus on-demand requirements. And what do I mean by that? Would be, is the application kind of always on? It's there, and users leveraging it every single day. That's perfect for us. Versus, hey, I run an environment, and that could be retail, it could be seasonal, it could be some type of environment where I have to turn on thousands of servers in an extreme example. And I want to use them for a very short period of time. And then I want to do some type, maybe it's a mathematical algorithm or something of that nature, and I want to turn them off on demand. That's a great example for the hyperscalers. It's perfect, especially for an environment like AWS. There's many others, but in that scenario, that's not one that's going to meet the RapidScale value proposition, for example. Going back to what Andrew was talking about, day-to-day brick and mortar business, think mid-market, think, a financial company, a law firm, a healthcare company. They've got applications, PCs, files, mobile devices, and they just need help managing it on a day-to-day basis. Their models are pretty predictable, and technology is being leveraged to run that business, and it's essential, but it is not their business. And I think more, hey, as these companies mature, they're going to start leveraging hybrid type models where they might have an application or a workload that maybe needs to be in the hyperscalers, but the vast majority of their core IT needs to be managed by a company like us. And then we're kind of shifting here. We're wrapping up. We got through the objections. I think that these are some of the common ones. We've covered some of the common ones we see. But if you get through the objections, how do you know if there's a deal? And as a sales professional, leading a sales team, working with partners, doing this now for 20 plus years, it comes back to a common denominator that I'm always thinking about, and that is, what is it? What exists that will that's going to motivate this customer to take action? And all too often, every day, our pipeline's filled with opportunities that we're trying to understand. Is it how am I positioned? What's actually happening? Is the customer going to pick us, choose a competitor? But we often fail to recognize what happens if they do nothing. And if the answer to that question is unclear, or quite frankly, if it's very clear and the consequences aren't very great, don't forecast a deal is really my advice. Rather look for that compelling event. Look for some type of reasoning that is creating a sense of urgency. We put a couple examples here, Andrew. Are these examples of a compelling event? I'd be interested in your feedback here, right? So a security breach. The business recently faced a data breach which they were not prepared for. Would you classify that one as a compelling event?
I would, yes. And kind of what happens to a customer when this happens, essentially they realize that maybe I can't do this myself, right? Maybe so-and-so who told me about this cloud company is more secure, something I should take a look at. So I actually had a meeting yesterday where this exact thing came up, and we kind of discussed it and dug in and immediately came up with a solution how that can never happen to their business again. So certainly something that we want to take a look at if it does happen with them.
So the only thing I would say there is to be careful of is that time is your enemy. You might have a security breach. Everyone's got a high sense of urgency, and as weeks and months go by, if they haven't acted, memories can be short, and it would be best to try and take advantage of that while it's top of mind. Compliance. New compliance regulations mandate that a system is in place by a certain date. I think that would be a yes, wouldn't you?
Yeah, so I mean, the early days, HIPAA was probably one of the biggest drivers that we saw for the healthcare companies to move to a cloud, right? All these healthcare companies that were doing it themselves were realizing very quickly that they're not able to keep up with those standards and regulations. But by moving to a cloud company, that doesn't make you HIPAA certified, but we certainly do enable that compliance.
Yep. And then lastly here as the example, kind of management. The business lacks IT resources and requires better support. What about that one?
Yeah, and I would categorize kind of technical skill set as well within management. So I mean, it could be obviously the day-to-day sustainability of managing an environment, which can be a lot for a customer. But what if they do have like a virtual desktop initiative to drive this out because they want to move to a VDI, right? Well, they don't have the technical resources, so they might want to go to a third party to leverage that. So I kind of categorize those both into the same.
Yeah, and I kind of look at it, maybe that's the weakest one, to be honest, and I kind of look at it as saying, hey, is it a want or is it a need? And it kind of reminds me of my kids, right? But is it do you really want this, or do you absolutely, is it critical, do you need it? The biggest traps are disaster recovery. I'll give you an example. IT director says, you know what, we need to further mitigate risk. I'm looking at options for DR. Beware, because you're getting into a scenario where the customer is going to end up saying, I want to see this option, I want to see that option, without taking action. That's very different than understanding that your customer, for example, just signed a new agreement with a large pharmaceutical company, for example. And that pharmaceutical company, in the SLA they're making your customer agree to, is mandating that they meet very specific recovery time and recovery point objectives. Those are two very different scenarios. Another example of a compelling event would be, hey, we're looking at options for data center and OpEx versus CapEx. And you're kind of getting into that. If you follow some sales tactics, you might be familiar with what they call a CMOR. CMOR would say, I want to see more of this or more of that, versus a customer that says, hey, my lease in this building is up June 1st, and we have to take action because we're out of here. Well, you know what? A decision is going to be made, and that's definitely a compelling event. So finding the compelling event, maybe the board's mandating that the decision be made. Again, thinking about what happens if they do nothing. If the answer to that question is somewhat vague or the consequences aren't very high, that deal may not be as active as we would like it to be.
Yeah, and to add one more thing to that real quick, the reason why we need such a compelling event is because it does take work, and there will be a little bit of pain if they move to the cloud, right? You're changing things, right? You're changing where your data's at. We're going to have requests of them, and it's going to take time. So you want it to be something that they need to have as a business, as an initiative, and some drivers on the back end to make it essentially come to fruition.
Yeah, and you usually find this out through kind of your discovery process, right?
Yep.
So Andrew, we're about to wrap up here. We're running a little bit longer than usual, but nothing excessive. I know you're familiar with this anatomy of a deal or our case study, and I'll turn it over to you. Maybe walk through this and incorporate some of the concepts that we've talked about today.
Yeah. So kind of coattailing off the compelling events, right? One that we didn't discuss was having an existing hosting provider or the incumbent that has not done a good job. This customer in particular was 3 or 4 years ago, they decided to go to a full Citrix desktop as a service hosted managed model with a company that we're actually familiar with. Turns out that they had a awful experience. The support was terrible. They had a lot of downtime. They had basically be taken offline for hours a day. And it was just an overall bad experience for them, right? So it really has to be a bad experience if they're going to want to do this whole migration again to a different company. However, when they do come to you and say, our contract's up in April and we need to make a decision on a new provider to go to, we like the technology, we like the way of doing business, we just don't like the people we're doing it with, that's a real opportunity, right? So that's essentially what happened with these folks. It was a large company based out of South Florida, a healthcare company, multi-location, do some property management stuff. Essentially, they needed to move away from their current provider. The way that we were able to essentially position ourselves in kind of the A position here was our ability to do Citrix, our experience in Citrix, and they needed that because they were running on Citrix today. So they wanted to have that level of comfort along with it. So, long story short, 3-4 week sales cycle, pretty quick, right? Because they needed to make a decision. So that's obviously nice for all parties involved. And it's a good company to grow and a very good fit for us because we're also able to, they're going to be leveraging a lot of our managed services on the back end on the day-to-day sustainability stuff.
No, it's great. So this is a customer that kind of fit that customer profile, right? I think you've outlined that pretty well. Mid-market type business in the healthcare space, leveraging IT to run the business. And if you think about cloud adoption versus, cloud convincing, if you will, that adoption, they had already chosen to consume IT differently. They were with an alternative provider, and they were looking to make change. Change was going to happen because of, as you kind of described, a really poor experience. It's key to understand when you're out there doing your selling, guys, that if you come across a customer that's with another provider and they're communicating with you about a poor experience, you really need to stay away from speaking anecdotally and kind of in a vague manner as well, and really get to the specifics, because there's varying degrees of poor service. If poor service equates to, they didn't call me back fast enough, well, that's still not good. But that's a very different degree than I've had chronic outages. You're likely going to have folks take action if that's the case, especially if these are mission critical environments, because downtime and unexpected loss of connectivity and data is money. And that's definitely a compelling event. Andrew, great job. That kind of wraps up today. Do you have any closing thoughts?
No, just obviously this is a big part of the sales cycle. The nice thing is as we said in the beginning, we're at a completely different place now than we were 5 years ago, so we can actually have business conversations as opposed to trying to convince a server hugger why running his servers in his janitor's office isn't a good idea. We're away from that. So, obviously embrace the conversation. Don't be fearful of getting it over your head, because all you have to do is kind of recognize an opportunity and then bring us in, and we're happy to assist where we can.
Absolutely. If you're involved in these deals and you're seeing these objections and need some help, let's engage. So with that, everybody have a great week, a great strong finish to the month of February, and we'll see you out there in the markets. Take care. Bye.